The bank teller slid the receipt across the counter, and Walter Boyd looked at the number printed on it for a long time before he folded it once and put it in his coat pocket. $41.16. That was what remained of a pension he had paid into for 26 years. 26 years of double shifts and bad coffee, and winters spent standing in doorways waiting for trouble that sometimes came and sometimes did not. He was 63 years old, and he had just spent nearly everything he had on people he had met 4 times. He walked out into the cold without his hat because he had given that away too, and the wind off the river found the back of his neck, and he did not hurry. What he did not know, what he could not have known, standing on that sidewalk with his hands deep in empty pockets, was that the act he had just finished was already moving through the city ahead of him, gathering people he had not spoken to in years, and that it would come back to him before the season was out in a shape he would never have asked for and could not have imagined. He thought he had given his money away to strangers. He had no idea he had been recognized. Stay with me, because the way this man emptied his account is the kind of thing most people only claim they would do, and the reason he did it goes back further than the family he gave it to. Walter had been a patrol officer and then a detective in the same precinct on the east side for most of his adult life. A wide brick building with a flag that never quite hung right, and a coffee machine had been broken since before half the current officers were born. He had retired 4 years earlier, not because he wanted to, but because his knees had finally quit on him after a foot chase down an icy stairwell, and the department doctor had signed the paper that ended the only work he had ever been good at. He had no wife anymore. She had passed 6 years before the retirement, and they had never had children, and so the house he went home to each night was quiet in a way that did not get easier with practice. He kept it clean. He kept her coat on the hook by the door. He made 1 pot of coffee in the morning and drank it black, and washed the cup before he left, even when there was nowhere to go. The family lived 2 streets over from the laundromat where Walter did his washing on Thursdays, in the bottom half of a narrow house with a porch that sagged on one side. He had noticed them the way an old cop notices everything, without meaning to and without forgetting. A young mother, maybe 30, who left before dawn in a grocery store smock and came back after dark. 3 children, the oldest a boy of about 11, who walked the 2 little ones to the bus stop and stood with them until the bus came and then ran the other direction to his own school already late. Walter watched this happen on a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of November while his clothes turned in the dryer, and he watched the boy give his own scarf to the smallest child because she was shivering, and he watched the boy do it without being asked and without making anything of it. And something in Walter's chest moved that he had thought was finished moving years ago. He learned their names slowly, the way you learn anything in a neighborhood, which is to say, by being present and by listening more than you talk. The mother was named Renee. The oldest boy was Curtis. The little ones were twins, a boy and a girl, 5 years old, and their names were the kind of small, bright names that mothers choose when they still have hope to spare. Walter found out from the woman who ran the laundromat that Renee's husband had been gone 2 years, not dead, just gone, the way some men go, and that she works the early shift at the store and cleaned offices 3 nights a week after that, and that the landlord had put a notice on the door in October that everyone on the street had seen, and no one had mentioned to her face. Walter heard all of this folding his shirts, and he said nothing, and he carried it home with him and set it down next to the quiet. There is a thing that happens to a certain kind of man when his work is taken from him, and it is not always grief, though it looks like grief from the outside. For Walter, it was a question he could not stop asking, which was what he was for now, what the point of him was, a man with 2 good hands and a bad pair of knees, and a heart that had spent its whole life pointed at other people's emergencies and now had nowhere to point. He had savings. He had the pension that came on the 1st of the month, and the small amount he had put aside over the years for an emergency that at 63 and alone he had begun to suspect would never come, or rather that he himself was the emergency now, the slow kind, the kind that ends in a recliner in front of a television. He did not want to die in a recliner. He wanted, one more time, to be the thing that arrived when someone needed arriving. So he began, quietly, to watch the family on the corner, the way he had once watched a corner, for a different reason. He learned that Curtis was a smart boy who had stopped raising his hand in class because the other children laughed at his shoes. He learned that the twins shared a winter coat between them, which meant that on the cold mornings only one of them could wait outside while the other stayed in, and that Renee had worked out a system where they traded, and that the system was the kind of thing that breaks a person to invent. He learned that the refrigerator in that house ran but did not get cold, and that Renee kept the milk on the back step in the winter because the back step was colder than the kitchen. He learned all of this without ever once knocking on the door because he did not want to embarrass her, because dignity was a thing he understood, having watched it taken from people his whole career and having sworn, somewhere along the way, that he would never be one of the ones who took it. And here is where the dramatic irony begins to tighten, because while Walter was learning the shape of this family's hardship, he did not know that one of them already knew exactly who he was. He did not know that the boy Curtis had seen his face before in a photograph, on a wall, in a building Walter had walked out of for the last time 4 years earlier. He did not know that the silence in that house held a connection to his own past so direct that had he known it that November, he would have sat down on the cold curb and not been able to stand back up. He thought he was a stranger doing a kindness for strangers. He was wrong about that, and the being wrong is the whole story. The decision came to him the way real decisions come, not in a thunderclap, but in a kitchen at 6 in the morning, over a cup of coffee he had washed and refilled 3 times. It was the first week of December. He had seen the eviction notice get a second sheet stapled to it. He had seen Renee come home one night and sit in her parked car in front of the sagging porch for 20 minutes before she went inside, not crying, just sitting, the way people sit when crying would cost energy they do not have. Walter set down his cup. He drove to the bank with his hands at 10 and 2, the way he had been taught 40 years before, and he parked straight between the lines, and he sat in the lot for a minute looking at the building through the windshield before he went in. Inside, it was warm and carpeted and quiet, and a young man in a tie waved him to a chair beside a desk with a small placard on it and a paper cup of pens, and the young man called him Sir before Walter had even sat all the way down. Walter folded his hands on the edge of the desk. He asked what it would take to clear a household's back rent, to fill a refrigerator that ran but did not get cold, to put new coats on 3 children and a pair of boots on a boy who had stopped raising his hand in class. The young man, not understanding, pulled a brochure from a little plastic stand and began to explain the bank's small dollar loan products, the rates, the terms, the way the payments would be structured over 18 months. Walter let him finish a sentence, and then he stopped him, gently, with one raised hand, the way he had stopped a great many things over the years. "I'm not borrowing," he said. "I'm spending. There's a difference." The young man, who was perhaps 26 and had a photograph of a baby taped to the side of his monitor and had never once heard a customer say such a thing, set the brochure down and looked at the old man across the desk for a moment longer than was professional, and then he said, "Yes, sir," and he stopped saying it like a script and started saying it like he meant it, and he did exactly as he was asked. It came to a little over $9,000 by the time it was done, which was very nearly all of it, which was the savings and most of the month's pension, and the small emergency cushion that he had decided sitting in that chair was for exactly this. He did it without his name attached. He paid the landlord directly and made the man promise, with the particular flat certainty of a retired detective who knew how to make a promise stick, that Renee would be told only that the debt was cleared by someone who wished her well. He arranged for a delivery of groceries, enough to fill that failing refrigerator and the cabinets above it, to arrive on a Saturday morning. He bought 3 coats sized by guesswork and a careful eye, and a pair of boots for an 11-year-old boy, and he left them on the sagging porch in the dark, before dawn, with no card, because a card would have a name on it, and a name would turn a gift into a debt, and he had spent enough of his life watching debt break people. What he did not account for, what no careful man ever fully accounts for, was the grocery delivery, and the fact that the company kept records, and that records have a way of being seen. The boy who drove the delivery van that Saturday was 19 and bored and had taken to scrolling on his phone between stops, and when he carried the 8th bag up to the bottom half of the narrow house, and the small girl in the doorway asked him in her bright 5-year-old voice who had sent all this food, he did not know, and he said so. and he thought no more of it. The order, though, had been placed in person, and Walter had paid in person, and the store, for its own reasons, had logged the name of the customer against the delivery address the way stores do. And that name, Walter, sat in a database where it would have stayed forgotten forever if a single thread had not been pulled. Renee did not understand what was happening to her, and the not understanding was its own kind of weight. She came home that Saturday to find her children wearing coats that fit, to find a refrigerator that was full, and when she opened it, cold, because the delivery men had also been paid to haul the broken one away and set a working one in its place, and she stood in her own kitchen with her hand pressed over her mouth and did not move for a long time. She called the landlord, certain there had been a mistake, certain the kindness would be snatched back, and the landlord told her what he had been made to promise to say, that the rent was current, that she owed nothing, that the person responsible wished her well and wished to remain unknown. Renee sat down at the kitchen table. Curtis stood in the doorway, watching his mother, 11 years old and old beyond it, and he said quietly that maybe it was the man from the laundromat, the man who was always there on Thursdays and never said much. And Renee said she did not know any man from the laundromat, and Curtis said he did. He said the man had a kind face and old eyes and that he stood like a police officer, and Renee told him to stop because hope was dangerous and she had 3 children's worth of it to protect and none to spend on herself. It was Curtis who pulled the thread, though he did not know it was a thread. The boy could not let it go. He had been raised by a woman who taught him that you say thank you, that you look a person in the eye when you thank them, that a kindness unacknowledged sits wrong in a house. So on the following Thursday morning, instead of running to his own school after the twins' bus pulled away, Curtis walked the 2 streets to the laundromat to find the man with the old eyes. And the man was there, folding shirts the way he always was. And Curtis stood in the doorway, gathering the courage that 11-year-olds have to gather in larger quantities than anyone gives them credit for. Walter saw the boy and felt his stomach drop, because he knew, the way he had always known things, that he had been found. Curtis crossed the laundromat floor and stood in front of him and said, "I think it was you. I think you're the one who helped us." And then the boy said the thing that would, within a week, reach across the entire East Side and pull the precinct's worth of people out of their ordinary mornings, because Curtis said, "My dad was a police officer too, before he died, and Renee says you stand like one, and I just wanted to say thank you, from all of us." Walter heard the words, "My dad was a police officer too, before he died," and the laundromat went very far away. He set down the shirt. He asked the boy in a voice he kept steady only by an act of will built up over decades what his father's name had been, and Curtis told him. And it was a name Walter knew. It was a name on a wall in the precinct he had served, on a brass plaque under glass in the front hall, the names of officers from that house who had died on the job. A wall Walter had walked past 10,000 times and saluted on the bad days and touched with 2 fingers on the worst ones. The boy's father had been an officer in Walter's own precinct, a younger man Walter had known by sight and by reputation, a man who had died in the line 8 years before Walter's own knees gave out, leaving behind, the department had been told at the time, a young wife and a baby boy. Renee was that wife. Curtis was that baby. And the husband who was gone was not a man who had walked out on his family at all, but a man who had been killed doing the work Walter had spent his own life doing, and the gone that the laundromat woman had reported, the gone that everyone on the street assumed, was the gentle, untrue story a proud widow had let stand rather than wear her grief in public. You should know, before the rest of this unfolds, that Walter had no idea any of this was true until a boy told him in a laundromat on a Thursday in December. He had given his pension to a family he believed were strangers. They were not strangers. They were the family of a fallen brother, the widow and the children of a man whose name Walter had touched with 2 fingers on the worst days of his own service, and he had no idea. And the not knowing is what makes what he did matter, because he did not do it for a brother. He did it for strangers. The brotherhood was already there underneath, waiting, but Walter had reached past it to the simple fact of 3 cold children and a tired mother, and that is the kind of thing that once it gets out, does not stay quiet. Walter did not tell the boy what he had just understood. He knelt down slow and careful on the bad knees so that his old eyes were level with the boy's, and he said that yes, it had been him, and that the boy did not owe him a thing, not a thank you, not anything, and that the boy should go to school now and that he should keep giving his scarf to his sister on cold mornings because that was the most important job in the family. Curtis hugged him, the fierce, unself-conscious hug of a child, and ran. And Walter stayed kneeling on the laundromat floor longer than his knees could bear, because he had just learned that the man whose name he had touched on the wall had a son, and that the son had stood in front of him and said thank you, and that the universe, which Walter had long since stopped believing, kept any kind of ledger at all, had apparently been keeping one the whole time. Here is the part Walter could not control and would not have chosen. Curtis, being a child and being unable to hold something that large, told his mother. And Renee, putting the pieces together over a long, terrible wandering night, understood that the stranger who had emptied his savings onto her porch was a retired officer from the very house her husband had served and died for, and she did the thing that grief and gratitude together will make a person do, which is that she could not hold it either. She called the one person from that old life she had stayed in contact with, a woman named Camille, who had been her husband's partner before the partnership ended the way it ended, and Camille still wore the uniform, still walked into that wide brick building every morning, and when Renee told her what an old retired detective named Walter had quietly done, Camille put down the phone and walked straight to her sergeant. The East Side Precinct was not a sentimental place. On the surface, it was a place of bad coffee and gallows humor and the particular exhausted decency of people who see the worst of a city on a daily basis and keep showing up anyway. Underneath the surface, it was something else, and what it was came up out of the floor that week, like water finding its level. Because the people in that building remembered Walter, they remembered a detective who had worked cases nobody wanted, who had stayed late without overtime, who had been kind to rookies and hard on bullies, and who had cleared his cases, not with brilliance, but with the dull, relentless patience of a man who simply would not quit. They remembered that his wife had died and that he had come back to work the following Monday because he did not know what else to do with himself. And they remembered, the older ones, the funeral of Curtis's father, 8 years gone, a young officer down, and they remembered that Walter had stood at the back of that funeral and had quietly paid for the flowers, all of them, and had never said so, and had been found out only because a florist once mentioned it to the wrong person. Camille's sergeant took it to the lieutenant, and the lieutenant took it to the captain, and somewhere in that chain a thing began that none of them had planned, and all of them recognized the moment it started, which was that the precinct decided to find out the rest. Not to repay Walter exactly. You do not repay a man like Walter because he will refuse it, and they knew he would refuse it. What they decided to do was harder and better than repayment. They decided to make sure that what he had done in the dark, with no name on it, did not stay in the dark, and that the family he had helped would never again be a family the world overlooked, and that the brother they had buried 8 years before would have, through Walter, the thing every fallen officer's family is promised and so rarely fully receives, which is that they would not be forgotten. It started with a quiet inquiry into the records, which is how Walter's name on a grocery order became Walter's name in a sergeant's notebook. Camille drove past the laundromat on a Thursday and saw, through the window, an old man she half remembered folding shirts, and she did not go in, because she wanted to be sure, and being sure was a thing her training and her grief both demanded. She pulled his file. She read 26 years of service condensed into the flat language of a personnel record, the commendations he had never mentioned, the foot chase that ended his career, the line where it noted he had declined the small disability supplement he was entitled to because, the note read, he did not wish to take what others needed more. Camille sat with that file for a long time. Then she made some calls, and the calls turned into a plan, and the plan turned into the thing that Walter, washing his cup at 6 in the morning with $41 to his name, did not know was rolling toward him. They learned everything. In the patient way that good investigators learn things. They learned that Walter had not just cleared the rent and filled the refrigerator. They learned, by talking to the landlord, that he had quietly paid the next 3 months ahead as well. so that the relief would not be a single Saturday, but a season. They learned, by talking to the grocery store, that he had set up a standing order, small but regular, to keep that refrigerator full into the spring. They learned that he had done all of this while declining his own disability supplement, while living on a pension he had now mostly given away, while keeping his late wife's coat on a hook by a door he walked through alone. And the more they learned, the more the thing in that precinct that was not sentimental on the surface turned out to be, underneath, exactly that. Because hard people are often the ones who feel these things most and show them least. Camille was the one who finally went into the laundromat on a Thursday in uniform, and the bell over the door rang the way it always rang, and the sight of the uniform made Walter set down his folding and straighten the way an old officer always will, his shoulders going back before his mind had even caught up. She was younger than him by 20 years, and she stood the way her partner had once stood, and Walter did not know her face. But he knew the type of stillness in it, the stillness of someone who has buried one of their own and never quite set the weight down. She told him she knew. She told him what Renee had said and what Curtis had said and what the records had shown, laying it out plainly, the way you brief someone you respect. And Walter, who had spent a career keeping his face still in front of frightened people and lying suspects and grieving families, found that he could not keep it still in front of this. A muscle worked in his jaw. He looked down at the half-folded shirt in his hands. He asked her not to make anything of it. He said the family did not need a fuss. They needed groceries and coats and rent, and they had those now. And that was the end of it as far as he was concerned. Camille did not move. She had loved her partner and buried him and carried his absence into that wide brick building every single morning for 8 years. And she looked at this old man who had quietly held up her partner's family without knowing whose family it was, and her voice was not quite steady when she said it. You didn't know who they were. It was not a question, and Walter, after a long moment, said no. He had not known. He had only known they were cold. Camille nodded slowly, and she had to look at the row of dryers for a second before she could speak again, and then she said that was the part nobody was going to be allowed to forget, and the machines hummed, and neither of them said anything for a while. 2 cops from the same house standing among the warm laundry of strangers who were not strangers. The precinct did not throw Walter a party, because they understood him too well for that. What they did was quieter and reached further. They started with the family. Because the family came first, the way the family had always been supposed to come first, and so rarely had. The department had a fund, the kind every department has and few use well. Money set aside for the survivors of officers killed in the line, and through some combination of Camille's insistence and a captain's signature and a long overdue correction of a file that had gone quiet 8 years before, it was discovered that Renee and her children had been owed support that had lapsed through paperwork and grief and a proud woman's refusal to ask. That was corrected. It was corrected fully, and it was corrected with back payment, and a woman who had been cleaning offices 3 nights a week after a full shift on her feet was told that her children's father had not been forgotten by the people he died beside, and that the support that should have held her up for 8 years would now hold her up going forward, and would reach back to cover what had been missed. Renee did not believe it at first, the way a person who has been let down enough times stops being able to believe in being caught. She made them say it twice. She made them put it in writing, and then she sat in the same parked car in front of the same sagging porch where she had once sat for 20 minutes too tired to cry, and this time she cried. Hard, the kind of crying that is mostly relief and partly grief, finally allowed to move. 8 years of it. And Curtis came out and sat in the passenger seat and put his hand on her arm, the way his father might have, and the twins watched from the porch, in their coats that fit. And the thing that started with an old man's $41 and his refusal to die in a recliner had become, for this family, the floor under their feet that they had been missing for 8 years. The part that was for Walter, the part he had tried to forbid, came in a form he could not refuse, because it did not look like charity and did not feel like a debt. The precinct was not finished. They did not give him money. They knew he would not take money. Instead, the captain offered him something that an old detective with bad knees and an empty house and a heart with nowhere to point would find impossible to turn down, which was work, real work. The department ran a program for the families of fallen officers. Program that had existed mostly on paper, underfunded and unstaffed, the kind of good intention that withers without a person to carry it. They asked Walter carry it. They asked him to be the one who made sure that no other widow on the east side cleaned offices in the dark while a support payment sat lapsed in a file, that no other child stopped raising his hand because of his shoes, that the promise the department made to its fallen was a promise kept and not a plaque on a wall. They offered him a small salary, which he tried to decline, and they told him the salary was not negotiable because the work was real, and real work is paid, and Walter Boyd, 63 years old, who had spent 4 years asking what he was for, finally had his answer handed back to him by the very building he had thought he had left for good. He took the job. Of course he took the job. He took it the way a man takes a hand up out of cold water, and he was good at it. Better than anyone expected, and exactly as good as the people who remembered him would have predicted, because the same dull, relentless patience that had cleared his cases turned out to be precisely the thing the families needed. Someone who would not quit on the paperwork, who would sit in the kitchens and listen more than he talked, who knew how to make a promise stick. Within his first month, he found 2 other families on the east side whose support had lapsed, and he fixed it. And he did not let anyone make a fuss about that, either. There is a thing the Precinct did at the very end of that December that Walter could not stop and would not have stopped if he had known how, because it was not for him and it was not about him, not really. On the wall in the front hall of that wide brick building under the glass were the names of the officers from that house who had died on the job, and Curtis's father's name was among them, and it had been among them for 8 years. Camille brought Renee and the 3 children to that wall on a cold, clear morning, and she showed Curtis his father's name under the glass, and she told the boy that his father had been one of theirs and would always be one of theirs, and that the man who had helped them, the man from the laundromat, had touched that very name with 2 fingers on the hardest days of his own service, without ever knowing he would one day kneel on a laundromat floor in front of the boy that name had left behind. Curtis put his own hand flat against the glass over his father's name, and Walter stood a little behind them, where he could see the boy's hand on the glass. And for the first time in a great many years, the quiet that he carried did not feel like absence. It felt like company. I want to ask you something before this story closes, and then I will let it close. Have you ever done a kindness for someone you believed was a stranger, only to learn later that the thread between you ran deeper than you could have known? If you have, you understand Walter, and if you have not, I hope this is the year you find out. Stay close for a moment more, because the way this ended is the part I most wanted you to have. By the following spring, the bottom half of the narrow house with the sagging porch had a porch that no longer sagged, because Walter, who could not sit still, had spent 3 Saturdays fixing it with Curtis handing him tools and learning, without being told he was learning, what it looks like when a man shows up. Renee had quit the night cleaning job, not because the support made her rich, it did not, but because it made her able to be home when her children came in from school, which was a wealth of a different kind. The twins had their own coats, now 1 each, and on cold mornings both of them could wait outside, and they did, because waiting outside together is what children do when they are no longer cold. Curtis had started raising his hand in class again. His shoes fit. His teacher, who did not know any of the rest of it, noticed only that a quiet, smart boy had become a quiet, smart boy, who answered questions, and she thought nothing more of it, the way the world rarely sees the machinery underneath a change. And Walter went to work every morning at the wide brick building with the flag that never hung right, in a small office they had cleared for him near the front hall, and on his way in he passed the wall under the glass, and every morning he touched the name of Curtis's father with 2 fingers the way he always had, except that now it meant something it had not meant before, because now he knew the boy, and the boy knew him, and the line between a name on a wall and a child raising his hand in a classroom, 2 streets from a laundromat, ran directly through an old man who had once stood on a sidewalk in the cold with $41.16 and no idea what he had set in motion. He still made one pot of coffee in the morning. He still washed the cup. His late wife's coat still hung on the hook by the door, and he still came home to a quiet house. The quiet, though, was different now, the way a house is different when the people in it are loved even from a distance, and on Thursday afternoons there was a boy who came by after school to help with whatever needed helping, and sometimes the boy brought the twins, and the kitchen that had been quiet for 6 years had, in it, the sound of children, which is the sound of a future that someone decided was worth paying for. Walter had spent his pension on a struggling family's Christmas, believing them strangers, and the precinct that raised him had found out, and in the finding out everyone learned what the old man had known all along without being able to say it, that a kindness given in the dark with no name on it is the kind the world remembers longest, and that the ledger we stop believing in is keeping our account anyway, and pays it back, in time, in full. If this story moved you, tell me in a word what you would have done with that last $41 and then stay for the next one. About a school janitor who fixed the same broken clock every morning for 9 years and the day the building finally found out why.